Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. It's been a busy week. There's a lot to talk about, as you might expect. So, if you're new to the show, let me just remind everybody we don't cover all the political news of the week. We just cover some of the big political news of the week, or the things that I find most interesting and most important. So, for example, there was a No Kings protest this weekend. Not going to get to talk about that this week, mostly because I really don't think that impacts politics, at least in the medium term. So we're going to start with something a little bit more different. I want to talk about an article I read in ProPublica, which I've linked below if you're interested in reading it for yourself. They found more than 170 U.S. citizens have been held by immigration agents. So if you're a longtime listener of this show, you will know that I'm pretty hardline on immigration. I do not like illegal immigration of any kind, even if there are economic benefits. And I've grown skeptical of immigration from the third world, and I've explained this on my show many times before. So let's go through what the article said, and I'll give you some of my thoughts and how I think the Trump administration could improve and prevent this from happening in the future, which I don't think they will. I don't think they care, but if they did, what they could do. So it starts with the Supreme Court decision allowing race to be taken into consideration. That happened last month in a case where Brett Kavanaugh, in the majority opinion, wrote, if officers learn the individual they stopped as a U.S. citizen or otherwise lawfully in the United States, they promptly let an individual go. However, that is not entirely true. So he said they would let it go. That's not entirely true. About 24 Americans said they were held for more than a day without being able to contact loved ones or lawyers. The government does not keep track of U.S. citizens who have been arrested, so ProPublica found 170, which is definitely an underestimate. 20 of them were children, and 2 had cancer. 4 were held for weeks with their undocumented mother of the children, by the way, without access to a family attorney until a congresswoman from Michigan intervened. ProPublica found that ICE held Americans after agents questioned their citizenship, and nearly all of them were Latino. As they write, ICE can detain a U.S. citizen when they're interfering with the immigration process. So, for example, say they're doing an immigration raid, and I show up and try to cause a bunch of problems, they will detain me. So they usually write that these cases usually don't stand up to scrutiny. They also accuse the Trump administration of deporting U.S. citizens' children back with their parents, except this also doesn't stand up to scrutiny because usually parents choose to take their children with them. So there's a famous case in Guatemala of a Guatemalan parent who was deported, and her U.S. citizen child was quote-unquote deported, even though she didn't have to be deported. It was the parent that wanted to bring the child with her, which is exactly how it should be. If you are an illegal immigrant and you have a child in this country, you should take your child with you. And I'll let you read the rest of the article if you're interested. So what are my thoughts? Well, it's definitely not okay that U.S. citizens are being detained and held for more than a day or even a day. Checking someone's immigration status is pretty easy. If the person has an ID on them, that ID can be checked, especially depending on the state. Certain states give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, which I think is crazy. But for example, in my home state of Pennsylvania, if ICE came here, anybody with a Pennsylvania driver's license, if that's actually them, we know that they are not an illegal immigrant. So the police can run an ID check to see if the ID is fake. If they don't have an ID on them, that would be reasonably suspicious. If you're an adult and you don't have any sort of ID on you, like a driver's license or a state ID, that should be a problem. There is an interesting idea that's been floating around Britain at the moment of creating a national ID, although theirs is considered a digital ID, where it would basically be you would have a national card instead of being given by the state government. It would be by the national government, and I actually think that would be a pretty good idea. There are some civil liberties concerns. I could explain the pros and cons of that in a separate episode, but for now, that is something that we don't have in this country. We do have a social security number, but you don't really want to be giving out your social security number to people, so a national ID would make it safer. However, usually conservative and libertarians are against that. At the same time, though, if you have a bank statement or a utility bill, that should be good enough to identify who you are. I'm not going to defend what ICE has done here. Nobody can. But let me say from the other side, if you have an administration that has failed for 4 years to control the border and you have massive backlash, the party that was in charge has only themselves to blame. Democrats should only blame themselves. Of course, that's little comfort to those individuals who are clearly, even if they voted Democrat, it's not their fault that they're being detained. They should definitely file a class action, in my opinion. That's something they should consider doing with their lawyers. I definitely hope ICE can avoid arresting and detaining U.S. citizens that aren't obstructing law enforcement. I would suggest there's rumored to be a quota system. The Trump administration denies it. The media says there is. I would tend to think there is a quota system, and the only reason I say that is because there's a specific goal of a number of immigrants that need to be deported, and if you're going to have a goal, then you're going to need a quota to meet that goal. So that's just kind of common sense. If there is a quota, then I would think that we would know what that is. That would be leaked at some point, but we don't. This administration's still pretty early days. It's only been 9 months as of today. Actually, it's a 9-month anniversary. So I would think that if they're going to do a quota system, it would have to be a points-based system where they could say, all right, you get 1 point for arresting somebody, you get 10 points for deporting them. But if they're a U.S. citizen and you deport a U.S. citizen, which, as far as I know, there has not been any confirmed instances of a U.S. citizen who is being involuntarily deported from the country. If there is, please let me know. There's been a few, but honestly, the media I noticed that they really can't be trusted on things like this. It's very hard. It's very hard to trust the mainstream media, and I hate to sound like one of those people, but they're very hard to trust. So I would think that if they deport a U.S. citizen, then that would be that officer or whoever deports them. First of all, should go through a court. The court system they would need to be investigated, but if they do end up getting deported, then obviously they should be compensated for that. So anyway, that's some things I think they could improve on. Maybe considering a national ID. I think that would be the easiest way to do it. I think Democrats would support that. And the reason I think Democrats would support it is because they're opposed to voter ID for U.S. for U.S. citizens or for anybody. And if you give everybody a national ID that you make either free or affordable, then there would be no excuse as to voting. Like, everyone would have an ID. Also, by the way, everybody does have an ID at the moment. That's a stupid argument. Most of the country supports voting, showing an ID while you vote. But even if you're going to say, well, there's people who don't have IDs, which is not really true. But if you're going to say it's true, then you can get a national ID, and that could fix the problem, the quote unquote problem. So as I was writing the segment I just ended, it came out that an illegal alien in Illinois became a police officer and has a pension. He overstayed his visa by 10 years. Of course, if you're not politically aware, Illinois is a blue state. Knowingly hiring an illegal immigrant is illegal. And for illegal immigrants to be hired, they need to use stolen Social Security numbers. It is also illegal for aliens to have a gun, which he obviously did because he was a police officer. So to anyone out there who supports illegal immigration, or at least is passive about it, they're like, it's not a big deal, it doesn't affect me. Let me challenge you here. Doesn't this make you angry? This guy made $80,000 a year in a pension and made $205,000 in the year 2025. This makes me very angry, and I hate this. This is a job that could have gone to an American, but instead it went to an illegal immigrant from Montenegro. If that doesn't make you angry, then I don't know what to say about that. One of the biggest successes, moving on, of the second Trump administration, if this holds, will be the ceasefire agreement in Gaza. I know I'm many weeks late to this. However, considering most of the ceasefire agreements, I saw this cartoon, political cartoon, and I believe it quite well describes the situation I think we're headed for. And I'll put it up on screen right now. I didn't want to discuss it because there was very little evidence that it was going to hold, and I don't think it will hold. I think in the next few weeks, if even that, it's going to collapse, and it looks like we are already witnessing the collapse. I'm not going to explain too much into it because I don't think, I'll explain a little bit, but I'm not going to get too much into it because I don't think it really affects us, and it's not going to work out anyway, in my opinion. For example, Israel has begun attacking Gaza again and restricting aid, and Hamas has refused to release some of the prisoners. As I said, I'm going to make a not so bold prediction and say that this ceasefire is going to collapse in weeks, if not sooner. However, this is definitely a great first step if it does hold, and it's 2 years in the making, in all honesty. God willing, this will lead to the end of the war. I don't think it will, but hopefully it does. I'm not going to kid you or kid myself that this is going to lead to lasting peace in the Middle East. This agreement was for a ceasefire and an exchange of hostages for prisoners. That's all it was. The 20-point peace plan, which is something that Trump came up with, will require a subsequent agreement, and I assume multiple agreements, which will have to be negotiated, and in all honesty, I doubt they will even happen. For example, demilitarizing Gaza is going to be a huge ask. Hamas is not going to like that. And at the same time, Trump proposed a quote-unquote board of peace, which he and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair is going to chair. What angers me as an isolationist is that we should be focusing on our own country, and every second that Trump spends chairing this foreign committee is a second that he can't serve as president of the United States. If this board really does exist, and it really does all work out as he plans, then it should be chaired by another American and eventually the Palestinians themselves. Because that's the ultimate goal of everyone who supports a two-state solution, as I do, which is that the Palestinians it needs to be a secure state where they can decide their own future. And there needs to be an Israeli state that is secure and that it can decide its own future. And I'm a strong believer that people should govern themselves. And I also believe if a country can't feed its own people or defend itself, like Israel and Gaza, then that country should not exist. Pure and simple. As I was reading the BBC article, which I link below, the author believes the only way to have a concrete forward is if one side decisively wins and the other decisively loses. He cites 1945 and the defeat of Nazi Germany, which at this point Israel is more likely, because it has full American backing among the political elites, to be the one that wins. That's if you support Palestine, I hope you understand that I'm not saying I want this to happen. I'm just saying that seems to be the most likely outcome. So that is where I think we're going. What would a total Israel win mean? It would mean a one-state solution, and it would mean ethnic cleansing. Is that what I want? Of course not. No. Do I see that as the most viable path forward? Unfortunately, yes. However, if that becomes the path that we take, it will lead to even more violence and bloodshed, which we do not want, obviously. Here's the thing, though. Under a normal circumstance, I would not care what Israel does. I think Israel could do, under normal circumstances, Israel could do whatever it wants to do. Ukraine could do what it wants to do. Sudan could do whatever it wants to do. China could do whatever it wants to do. However, we are bankrolling Israel. And we have for a very long time, really in the last 80 years. And I really think America should use its leverage over Israel more than we currently do. If I were president, I would consider pulling the plug, which I know would cause a row with the AIPAC, which is the Israel, the quote unquote, like the Israel lobby, and it would cause a row with many members of Congress. But if Trump is a lame duck president, he's got very little to lose. That's what I would do. I would say, like, Israel, you're going to do this, this, and this. If you don't do it, then see ya. Anyway, I don't want to dig too much into hypotheticals at the moment because there's still a long road ahead. We still have a long way to go, and I don't think there's going to be any kind of peace. But if there is, we still have a long way to go. Alrighty, moving on. We have the government shutdown, which I'm starting to believe will become the longest in history. There has been virtually no movement by either side. Instead, the Senate tried to pass a full-year spending bill rather than simply reopening the government. That failed. Democrats voted against it. It needed 60 votes to pass and still failed. Republicans have been reportedly internally negotiating with their House and Senate counterparts to get on the same page, which was supposed to put pressure on Democrats, and that didn't work. As for outside Washington, D.C., the Trump administration did move some money around and pay our military, and they pulled the money from research, development, and testing. And it's a shame they didn't do this with the rest of the federal government. I'm not even sure if this is legal, and it probably wasn't. But then again, Democrats would have to sue the administration, and suing because the defense paid the military is really a bad look. So I don't think you're going to hear a peep from Democrats about that. At the same time, the administration is threatening more quote-unquote reductions in force, which are really just layoffs, and they say that they're making every preparation to ride out the shutdown as long as it takes, which shows that this might actually be one of the longest shutdowns in U.S. history, as Speaker Johnson predicted. To break the record, we would need to go until November the 5th, which would be a total of 35 days because the last shutdown was 34 days. And that was also, by the way, the last shutdown was under President Trump. So Two records will be broken, maybe. And as for public opinion, I've said this over the last month, really. As long as Democrats continue to keep public opinion on their side, they can do basically whatever they want. The Hill reported in a YouGov and Economist poll, it showed that Americans are starting to blame Democrats more for the shutdown than Republicans. And I linked this article below, so you could take a look at it if you're interested. And as said a couple of weeks ago, Democrats could go as long as they want. As long as they kept the public on side, except the gap is now starting to narrow, and this could be a pretty big problem. 39% of Americans blame Trump and Republicans in Congress, while 33% blame Democrats. 20% said they blame both sides equally. So the numbers are starting to shift, and if it keeps going, I will think Democrats are going to need to cave, but they will need to do it in a way that isn't embarrassing or gives Trump a win, which is going to be pretty difficult. According to the Hill article, which I linked below, as I said, the biggest swings are among independents. 17% of independents blame Democrats before, and now it's risen to 26%. And we've seen some evidence in generic ballot polling. Republicans closed the gap a little bit. It's still within the margin of error. But for Democrats, their lead on the Real Clear Politics polling aggregator went from 2.5% down to 1.7%, which is a very small margin, a very small drop, but it's still important. And at that point, 1.7%, I believe, is not going to be enough to retake the House of Representatives next year, or to pick up really any Senate seats. Unlike in Trump's first midterm, Democrats have not had this large and sustained lead in the polls. So, for example, if you go back to 2017 and early 2018, they had a 7, 8, 9-point lead in the generic ballot. And the largest lead they've had over the past year has been 4%, which, considering all that Trump has done to put off moderates, that's pretty pathetic. I mean, at this point, I disapprove of this administration as well. And a good way to tell if I approve or disapprove of the administration is to see where the president's approval rating is. If it's generally below 45%, usually I'm against it, and we are definitely under 45% at this point, and I'll explain why in a moment, why I disapprove. We're not going into the midterms right now, so it's not a huge concern for Democrats, but I am becoming increasingly concerned that they may not win the House. However, the good news for them is Americans' memory are becoming shorter and more like a goldfish as the years go by, so maybe people are going to forget about this. I definitely think it's interesting that we have this brewing crisis here at home, and the president has been focused almost entirely abroad in the last 2 weeks. It shows that he believes the shutdown might be his weak point, and that foreign policy is his strong point. The polls are showing this strategy might be working. It's still only one poll, and we'll have to wait and see if anything changes in the coming weeks as we enter the 4th week of the government shutdown. And then lastly, I don't have any notes on this one, but I did hear that, I talked about this a few weeks ago, it might have been last week, the U.S. government gave $20 billion in a bailout. Well, we didn't give it, we bought, it's complicated, but we gave them a $20 billion bailout, and we basically bought a bunch of Argentinian pesos in exchange, which are basically worthless. So we basically gave them $20 billion, and the administration is considering doubling it to $40 billion. And then Democrats made a really good argument here. Their demands in the shutdown, which were to have more Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare subsidies, that would have cost $35 billion a year. So now they only asked for 35, and now the administration is looking at spending 40. So think about that. We have American farmers here that are struggling to sell their soybeans because of the trade war. We have Argentina, which has now been buying Chinese soybeans because of the trade war. And we have a U.S. government that is bailing out Argentina, as we have the American government being shut down, and we have farmers that are struggling here at home. So if you ask me, that is despicable. I'm absolutely opposed to this. This is horrific. And then there's the conspiracy theories which I believe might actually be true, is that the only reason the administration, because a lot of the people either in the administration or supporters of the administration, they invested in Argentina after their president won in 2023, and there's motivation to help bail them out to keep, so they don't lose their money. So if that is true, then there should be some people thrown in prison for that. So we'll have to wait and see. If Democrats do take control of the House, I absolutely hope they investigate, and they hope that they can prosecute. And if there is a Democratic president in 2029, then they should consider using the Department of Justice to prosecute. So that is the end for this week. It's a little bit longer than usual. If you're new to this show, normally we're only about 15 minutes, so we went a bit over, and there's still so much we didn't talk about. So thank you for tuning in as always, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.